In this presentation, we will be talking about general guidelines to analyzing literature. I will be covering 4 of those guidelines in this presentation. Let's begin by covering Guideline 13. And Guideline 13 talks about you being able to identify variances or differences in the literature you're going to be using. And basically what those gaps mean is that the research in these particular areas and these particular gaps probably became an obstacle for any researchers to continue their investigation that particular route. And these gaps will allow you as a scholar to identify then which ones would be the best resources to use. So you will become more analytical in terms of what particular resources to choose for your investigation. And that leads me to the following point. That will lead you to define the direction of your investigation. As you begin to gather all the articles that you will be using for your investigation, like I mentioned previously, you need to look for those gaps. So I have 2 different articles to talk about right now. You need at least 2 to be able to find those differences or find those variances. The first one, and this is where we encounter the very first gap, only focuses on credit card debt. So even the article's title is a little misleading because they title this particular article like Financial Knowledge and Student Loan Usage in College. And when you go on to reading the actual article, you begin to see they focus a lot on credit card debt. Now, that's a gap. When you begin to do your investigation, if you're going to focus on student debt, you need to be careful that you choose exactly what you want to be included in your presentation in terms of the information that each article provides you with. The second article that I encountered, this one is particularly talking about the racial factor for having credit card debt. It did not explain who they consider a vulnerable student to be. They do go into detail about vulnerable students and vulnerable students being more prone to being in debt. However, they don't specify what they consider a vulnerable student to be. And then they move on, and they say that race is definitely a factor when it comes to being in debt, but the research does not provide percentages of how many African American students were surveyed. They talk about the African American community having higher percentages of debt within their students. However, they don't give any percentages of how many African American students were actually surveyed. So that's another gap. They give you certain information, they don't give you the entire picture. When you begin to gather all of the information that you want to include in your research, you need to be very analytical, and you need to be able to identify those gaps or those differences in the literature that you will be using. And I have 2 examples to kind of guide you in terms of how to identify those gaps. So first of all, you need to know exactly what the focus of your investigation will be. In my case, just to kind of give you an example, I'm going to focus on student loan debt. So the very first example that I have to give you is an article that talks about student debt, and they focus a lot on credit card debt. And the title is a little misleading because the title says Financial Knowledge and Student Loan Usage in College. But when you move on to reading the article, you begin to see that they focus a lot on a particular topic, which is credit card debt. Now, if you're focusing on student loan debts, you will definitely not use this particular journal or this particular article because you would be deviating from the focus of your investigation. So that gap right there is to kind of show you that you would have to go a different route. Now, this second article that I have talks about an analysis of current status of student debts. So this particular research did not take into account the race factor for having credit card debt, nor did it explain who they consider vulnerable students to be. So very interesting because this particular article talks about race, but they talk about a particular race being more vulnerable to being in debt, but they don't give any percentages of students from this particular race, African Americans, being surveyed. So that's a gap. They talk about African Americans having higher percentages of student loans and debts overall. However, they don't give you any percentages of how many African American students they actually surveyed to kind of support what they're telling you. Let's move on to the next guideline. Guideline 14 focuses on identifying the similarities among the journals, among the studies, among the articles that you have. Now, keep in mind that you have to have enough sources to be able to do this, to be able to pick the best journals or the best articles for your investigation. When this happens, you should begin to identify the relationships among all of the studies, all of the journals, all of the articles that you have. And you can begin by grouping them, maybe by age group, maybe by language, by gender, ethnic group. So whatever they cover, you should be able to group them so you can begin to see the similarities. Now, you need to point out these relationships when you begin to take your notes so that once you get ready to include some of these articles, you know which ones go together based on the way that you grouped every single one of these. In the next section that I'm going to cover, I'm going to talk about writing a draft reference list. So after you've gone through Guideline 13 and Guideline 14, then you need to create a draft reference list. And basically, the first point that I have here in my PowerPoint presentation is evaluating your sources. So is this source really going to help me with my investigation? Is it really worth including it? Is it a good, reliable source that I want to include in my investigation? Choosing the best sources is the next point that I want to cover. So choosing those sources that you know will make your final investigation strong. And then the third, assess your reference list. So right before you wrap up, make sure that you assess every single reference that you have on your list to see if it's a good, strong source that you want to continue to use or use ultimately in your investigation. Now let's move on to Guideline 15. In Guideline 15, you're going to determine if the articles relate to your topic. You need to always keep in mind what the focus of your investigation is. So then you'll be able to pick and choose which articles really relate to the topic that you want to cover. That's why you need to, again, focus on your topic. Do not use references that have no relationship to your topic. That's very, very risky. You don't want to do that. You want to maintain your topic in mind at all times so that you don't deviate and begin to use articles that are really that have no importance to what you really want to cover your investigation on. And always use your notes that you took previously from each of these articles. So whatever notes you took using your note cards, you should be able to pull those out and begin to see which of the resources, which of the articles that you have really focuses on the topic that you want to cover. Now let me give you an example to kind of guide you so you know exactly what I'm talking about. Remember to keep in mind the topic that you're covering in your investigation. So let's say we're going to be talking about student debt in particular ethnic groups. Let's focus on the African American community for the purpose of this training in this particular example. So I found this article that talks about the African American community. They take into account the racial factors. Additionally, this particular article indicates that students progress in their careers, and as they progress, the possibility of getting into more debt is higher. And this research was conducted in the University of Alabama in South Alabama. And it gives you percentages of the different ethnic groups that they surveyed. So you can use this as an example for your research. Now let's cover Guideline 16. So Guideline 16 is basically for you to assess your references. And you're almost done, but not quite. This particular guideline focuses on you being able to determine if you want to include certain articles in your investigation. And you need to have this list and you need to have these references. They have to be up to date in order for you to be able to use them. And you need to keep in mind that the rule of thumb is a 5-year span. So if you have these articles and you're looking at them, you're perusing them, and you see that certain articles are older than that, then you would probably be better off if you don't include them. Now, if you see that they have specific information that you were unable to find anywhere else, you could take the risk of using these articles or the information covered on the articles. But if you know they're old, you know they're not up to date, they're not within the 5-year span, then you're better off not including them in your investigation. Now let's wrap up. This training was created with the purpose of allowing the students to have a more critical eye, choose your sources wisely, and focus on whatever topic you've chosen for your investigation. Now, there are 16 guidelines that you have to follow. This particular training, this particular presentation only covers 4. But one of the objectives, one of the many objectives that we have with this particular training is for you to be able to categorize articles. Now, that's only one of them, but we also expect that you know how to use your index cards effectively and efficiently. And then finally, you should be able to draft a reference list. Now, the highlights of this training are that you will be able to peruse articles or journals with a more critical eye. Now, when conducting research, these guidelines will help you, as they will help you choose the best sources for your investigation. Additionally, with the different examples that we gave, for example, Guideline 11, you should be able to identify and categorize your articles. When conducting research, it is critical that you have the most up-to-date information about the topic that you are conducting your research on. All of the above mentioned highlights, everything that I have mentioned today, is what we consider are very important tools that you have at your disposal, and you should be on your way to conducting successful research.